This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. I have a special guest today to help me break down some big ideas around the world. First, a little story. Some of you know this, some of you may not, and my guest may not even know it. We'll see. Back in my mid-20s, and this would be the early 90s, very early 90s, I was what you would call a radical socialist leftist, environmentalist. You know, put all those together, everything that they hate on Fox News. I was one of those kids. And it was just where I was at, you know. And you know, sometimes they say, you know, you should be a socialist in college, and hopefully that makes you a conservative, you know, when you're older. But for me, you know, I was reading books about greenhouse gas effects before there was, you know, 20 years at least before there was anything like the Paris Accord, and those were things that I was concerned about. So, you know, I was a tree hugger. But one thing I kept doing was studying and reading and looking for answers, because I wanted answers to how we could make the world a better place. And a couple of areas I was drawn to were, you know, what were businesses actually doing in the economy, and how were they providing jobs? And what were the foundations of democracy that made what was going on in America different than anywhere else? And I was also very interested in science and solutions to problems through science. And I sort of had an epiphany in 1992, and I read I just have been reading a lot of different books, but I can think of a half a dozen books that had an influence on me and sort of brought me around. I mean, everything from reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography and Common Sense by Thomas Paine to there was an economist named Herman Kahn who was countering everything that we had learned in the 70s about the limits to growth. He was saying there were no limits. He wrote a book called The Resourceful Earth, which was about, you know, we can fix any problem, we can solve any solution with our resources, and that the earth wasn't in danger. So I had that big battle going on in my head, reading all these different competing books from the guys who were talking about the entering the greenhouse world to somebody like Kahn, who was saying the earth was more resourceful than we imagined. I read a book called Green Machines by Nigel Calder, a British author, about the coming era of biotechnology. You know, and this is in 1991, before anybody was talking about it. Another very interesting book I read, which is very timely now, was called Window of Opportunity. Oh, now I forgot the subtitle, but I'll think of it. In fact, I'll look it up. And it was by a gentleman named Newt Gingrich. And this was published in 1984, but I didn't read it until like 91, 92. And I was attracted to it because of the optimism, first of all. And on the cover, it had a picture of the space shuttle. And one of Newt's big ideas was that we needed to colonize space, starting with, obviously, an International Space Station, and then heading out into the solar system to you know, whether it's mining asteroids or whatever, or militarizing space. And so if you ever heard any ideas in the 80s about Ronald Reagan being in favor of this sort of thing, you know, Strategic Defense Initiative, SDIs, you know, what became called Star Wars, and the International Space Station, Newt had a hand in this when he was a young congressman in the early 80s. And so when I read this book in 1992, let's say, I was also being influenced by ideas about what America was, and what our opportunity was, and what liberty and justice and equality meant. And it sort of made me, it definitely flipped me to somebody who was didn't want to stop any technology, because technology was unstoppable. Like, it's gonna come, because what we are as human beings were tinkerers and inventors and creators. And so I could never stop anybody from inventing the next car or electronic device or weapon. They were going to do it. So we were all, that's what it meant to be human. If you looked at thousands of years of history, we're always creating some kind of new problem and we'll create the next solution. So I became pro-innovation and just said, okay, how can I work with this? What's interesting and why Newt comes back into this is just this week, the White House announced the launch of Space Force. They're going to create a whole new division of the military called Space Force. And obviously, I can't prove this right now, but I think Newt sort of had a hand in this behind the scenes. And what else might somebody like Newt Gingrich have stood for is sort of the nationalistic policies that the White House migrated towards in the past few years. And, so a lot of people have theories about, well, globalism is evil. It's the evil globalists that, have made China rich and have shipped our jobs overseas. And we could talk about other policies, but those are some of, like the economic ones are the ones I'm most interested. And I think those are interesting theories, but the world is, Thomas Friedman said the world is flat. I think it's not flat, but it's much more fluid, and that technology changes everything. And that's my theory. But I think if you look around, it's proven everywhere that technology breaks down borders. It completely wipes out industries, changes jobs, changes economies. Just think about the people hold this smartphone in their hands now that's 1,000 times more powerful, than a desktop computer of a decade ago, and we don't understand. It just software, changes everything as a component of technology. The hardware is there, but then software breaks down these barriers too. And I think that these kinds of forces are more powerful in changing economies and governments. We look at the democratic revolutions we're having around the world, like in Hong Kong, than anything. And so it makes people who are against globalism don't realize that it's happening whether they agree with it or not. So that's why I brought in our resident economist, Dr. John Blank, to discuss this with me, because John did a presentation for us here at Zacks, for our portfolio groups. He did a presentation just on this topic of the rise of populism and nationalism, and he tied it into ideas about economic growth. And so I thought he'd be the perfect guest to bat some of this around. So, John, what are the biggest trends that you see and have identified in the push towards nationalism, whether it's Brexit or what we see going on maybe in South America or elsewhere versus what's going on in Hong Kong?
Well, you got to start it on a big subject. I'll show my own age. I did a dissertation in the 90s on ending communism at that time. That was the big thing. The wall fell in our age, and that was considered just an amazing event. And it's almost forgotten now. And now in the last 2 years, we've had just an amazing array of populist right-wing experiences in Barcelona, Spain, with the trying takeover of Hong Kong by an authoritarian group from China that got pushed back. We have Trump in the United States. We have Boris Johnson just won in England, a conservative group that's pushing for the restoration of trade ties in a Canadian way for England, calling it Brexit at this point, basically trying to be Canada now.
Okay. I never looked at it that way.
Yeah, his basic idea is going to be, get the same deal Canada has.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the name's getting big and the contentions are happening, but it's effectively his idea is we'll be Canada. England will be Canada.
And I mean, I understand the the Brexiters, they don't want a central European authority telling them what to do. So it's like, give us our political sovereignty, and hopefully we'll make out better on the trade deal too.
Right. Well, this gets us into one of the subjects, this globalization. People have this rage at the EU. And economists like me have no rage at the EU. And I'm mystified by these people who are enraged with a bureaucratic rules-based regime, because all it is to make sure if you ever travel that you don't have to buy a power converter for every single country you go to.
Or change your currency.
Or change your currency.
Right.
These things are a hassle. So you go to Mongolia, like I did in July. You have to buy a special converter for Mongolia because they're in a certain part of the world with a certain converter. Then you go to Australia next year. Well, then you have a different converter. I have an entire converting set to set up the 10 or 12 conversions to just use electricity. So Brexit and these ideas of decentralization are going back to all these different subunits. And I don't get it because it's not helpful. I would just prefer one plug-in, right?
Yeah.
And this is what I don't get with the Brexiters, because they don't understand a lot of what the EU does is minutiae, setting up rules-based regimes so that the governments are out of the way. And free trade and free movement of people and free movement of capital is a very conservative idea and a good one. And letting their governments, who are clogged with all kinds of nefarious reasons for pushing back on this type of thing, have to deal with it. So I end up, any economist looks at it and says, hey, they're doing a great favor for you in setting up a rules-based regime, giving you some kind of tweaking event every once in a while, but basically allowing you to stop having all these conversion issues and change issues and regulatory differences that are costing you money and costing you time and costing you hassles.
Yeah. I mean, the Brits must think that there's something more in that central planning model that could hurt them in the future, and they just don't want to be locked into it.
Yeah. Here's an example of what I showed. I give you a classic physical example of what Brexit and these problems are. So I was with two couples in Telluride in March. And Telluride is 60 miles to Montrose by either limo, bus, or rental car. So the two couples and I are going at different times to leave from our airplane at the end of the trip. Brexit is the idea that I can get to the airport on my own cheaper.
Okay.
That's all it is. It's saying, I'm in Telluride and I want to go to Montrose, and I can get there cheaper than if I stay with my four friends in their rental car. How can I do it, Kevin? Just think it through. How can I do it?
I mean, people have all kinds of reasons why they won't carpool, and at the end of the day, the choice was another limo that facsimiled my friends, is going on my own and renting a car, staying later to go with someone else. But at the end of the day, I couldn't beat the scale of just leaving with them and getting to the airport. And the idea that's erroneous is Brexit is never true that I can get to the airport alone cheaper. Wow.
And that's what's going to happen with Johnson and all these people. Is the simple fact of the matter is when England starts to do things on their own, every trade deal has to renegotiate, which is a cost. Every transaction has to have some unique British element, which will be a cost. And costs will rise, and scale will fall, and transactions will slow. So this is a very, I mean, it really gets back to just sitting down and saying, how would I get to an airport 60 miles away on my own cheaper? What are you going to shoot me out of a cannon? I mean, and again, that's just the technology. In some ephemeral way, some hyperloop way that would disaggregate everything, I could do it. But if you don't believe that scale is done with, scope is done with, distance is done with, time is done with, it's never going to happen.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, this goes back to what I see in the real world about how technology changes everything, and a new generation might view things differently. For instance, I was a currency trader for most of the 2000s, traded the euro, and then when we go into the euro crisis and the Greek debt crisis and that, there were people like realistically talking about, the euro is going to fail. This currency is going to fail because all the peripheral countries, the Club Med, so to speak, Greece, Spain, Italy, that these countries were so loaded in debt that they were just going to drag down the core and obliterate this whole experiment. And I thought, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to find a way to make this work. Obviously, Mario Draghi said, whatever it takes. And I think the young people, the millennials of Europe, decided also it was just natural for them. They loved the freedom of the euro and to be able to travel to this big nation state.
Well, Kevin, you're getting to a point that's very, very true right now. Is globalization is really code for generational differences.
Yes.
In the United States, whether Democratic Biden 77 or Mitch McConnell nearly 80 or Donald Trump 73 represent a 30-year-old, the answer is no. And voters in this country that are older tend to vote more and more often and more regularly, and so they end up controlling governments. And the same is in England true. The older people of England are keeping their mindset on a version of England that they did enjoy and did know. And the younger generation that has experienced the European Union and has grown up with different toolkits to do software and get on internet sites and whatnot is just not.
Yeah. To them, there are no borders, right? Especially.
So a lot of it's generational.
Yeah.
What I'm pointing out is a lot of these languages and things are about generational things. I think the answer here is a lot of things just may take more convulsion and more chaos for generations to just give up on the past than we want to believe. Yeah. And right now we're going through one of these ripple events where the generation that controls our politics are older and they're ripping back time. They're trying to set us back. And to your point, I know which I agree with, in a long-term sense, they're going to fail. In a short-term sense, they're going to succeed.
The populist movements?
Yes.
Yeah.
And these attempts to roll back things and, put the pound and the, Pax Britannica back together. And, I was golfing in California with a 60-some-year-old guy from Northern England, and he laid out a case for Brexit from the first hole to the 15th hole before I was so grateful for 18 holes on a golf course. Right. But what I realize is for his generation, it just simply has done nothing for them in their minds. Right. They see it as nothing that they got anything out of, and they just want control back, and they want to go back to the way things were. And to your point, which is there's no way that the laptop you and I are talking through and on, and the Dell computers that are on Danny's desk, the producer today, and the people out there listening on all these audio headphones and internet-enabled 5G devices are going to be able to put the 1950s and 60s together again.
No. And the other thing we have to realize about a populist movement is that in terms of the behavioral aspect, human beings like to crowd together. They like to be in some sort of herd and know that they're on the right side and feel like they're on the right side. Like, this is my group. This is who I identify with. And it's not just ethnocentric. It's feeling like you're part of something. So,
but this gets to another problem we learned with social media and computers is that targeted advertising was seen as a great thing. Targeted politics has been a disaster.
Right. And
the other thing we've overdone is technology doesn't have downsides, and that's just plain wrong. We have a lot of issues with the fairness doctrine that has to be reimposed, giving both sides a view on anything that's posted. We have to get through some regulatory issues with Facebook and Twitter. Both have to be addressed, where you get 600,000 people who can band together for fascist information from just one source and nobody can compete with it. Right-wing groups all over the world have been made hay with this technology. So the other thing that's happened is we've exaggerated the idea that everything that happens is good and better. It's not true.
Of course, and that's the growing pains, and that's why 25 years ago I realized people were going to invent things that were going to blow our minds, but we just had to deal. We had to deal with it, right? So Facebook was kind of cool for a while, especially if you were an investor, right, and you made some money off of it, and then you realize, damn, this company just broke the universe. This is a crappy model, and so I applaud Jack Dorsey of Twitter for just saying, you know what? we're not going to do any political advertising.
Yeah.
He put a stake in the ground and said, I see how this can be misused. And for right now, our decision is we're just going to say no.
Then this is what's going to happen a lot more often, and we need to do it. And the other thing about populism you brought up, Kevin, we're not done with this idea because it's still very powerful, which is just transactional politics, right? You raise my stock market, you keep my job, you keep my house making, in a nicer neighborhood, whatever you're doing for me transactionally, I'm good with it, and I don't care about whatever else you do. And this works in history. It was mainly seen in Latin America. And what we've learned in Latin America is at this point in time, with all its populism in the 70s and 80s, it is still not the wealthiest part of the world. And it creates boom bust cycles.
Right.
So the United States has never had a true populist till now. And so it has not experienced internally the boom bust cycle of populism. So right now, you and I know the last 2-3 months, we're talking late December here, stocks have gone nothing but up because of the repo buying of the Fed.
Yeah.
And they go up every day, and everybody says, this is great. And that's populism. You say, it is great. I can't argue, and you and I at a stock picking company for sure don't care that it's not going up every day. We're good with this. But the problem is, as a stock strategist looking down the pipe, I say, you know what? We get to 19 PEs. You do this too. 20 PEs, 21 PEs. And the answer is you don't just keep going to infinity with making incredible money. You have a crash.
And you and I talked about this morning in another segment, is that I think the stock market has a free pass here to get overvalued because large investors really started ignoring the tariff tit for tat back in October, November, and whatever the headline is, they don't even care anymore, right? And the Fed has just told us they're not raising rates, so that's a free pass for this market to run up until before they start getting worried about the election and who's going head to head. Now, let me ask you this: so leave out the repo thing for a minute here, because that's more complicated. That's a nuance that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with. Let's say that doesn't have an effect. Is it enough that the Fed said they're on hold probably for all year? Basically the dot plot said we're on hold all year. Is that enough to drive the market higher? What I'm really getting at is big picture is people want to take responsibility for the big stock market rally of the past few years. And I mean, was it the tax cut? I mean, the tax cut did a lot for corporates.
But this is back to the global idea. The thing that Fed has done that's beneficial when you say the dot plot's more certain and more flat for the next year is a lot of central banks and currency traders have decided that's, if it's true, there's less worry about change than there used to be. Less risk, and so things can rise just simply because there's less risk. And the other thing that's going to happen here is it's possible that the non-U.S. world gains its footing when the Fed effectively stays out of the way of raising rates, which has caused the strong dollar and all these other effects and scared people away from their inflation of their stock markets and their currencies. So the other benefit here is it may well get the global markets back on their feet again.
Yeah, because then when you have this predictability about the Fed, you have predictability about the dollar, and then there's less of a dollar shortage.
Right, and then you see this last week. We had the Fed report on Wednesday. Now tomorrow there'll be 7, 8, 10 central banks that'll follow up. They'll read up what they thought the Fed said over the last week and then make decisions. So this is another very consistent pattern. The United States still leads in the monetary affairs of the world, and the world follows. But if the Fed gets out of the way by holding rates flat, it's going to create an ability for them to start to move in different ways.
All right, so here's what I'm really getting at. A populist president could get reelected because of what his administration and policies did for the stock market. But that's an illusion, don't you think?
Well, the illusion is that the stock market's going up because of his policies being so well adopted to the economy. And the truth is most of it is just the Fed pushing more liquidity in the markets and all the other banks. So, but this is what populism does. It creates this, who's going to argue with their stock going up?
Yeah.
No one's going to argue with that. So then the guy who's running things says, well, if it makes people happy to run the stock market up, then run it up. Now, the problem with that is, since there's no real pushback on that, is you get to a point where the stock market's 25 PEs and people start selling, or they can't afford stocks, or they're putting money in from their income that's running an economy that doesn't go up 20% a year, and they're getting less and less in their 401ks.
Well, as we've seen from history, that's how it always ends.
Yes. And this is what happens. People have to understand why people like me are reluctant to see this, because you unhinge the economy from the financial market, and there's inevitably going to be a crash.
Yeah, and the bigger drivers that I'm trying to reference here are, what do we know about bull markets? Well, bull markets grow out of a recession trough. Right. There's some recession trough, and the stock market sees the worst coming, and the stock market bottoms and takes off even before you've seen the end of the recession. It always happens. And then, how long does the bull market last? Well, it's probably going to last at least as long as the economy stays out of recession. And what has the economy done? It's stayed out of recession. Why has it stayed out of recession? Because of the Fed. Because the Fed is backstopping it at every turn. I mean, there have been animal spirits, and I would say technology and healthcare are big drivers of those animal spirits, and deregulation from Trump's White House policies probably helped in some places. But the bigger force and flow here is an economy that's humming along, and the Fed kept it humming along. You know, whenever we thought it had to go on life support, like 2015, 2016, things stabilized. We didn't crash, and then we come back. The Fed says, "Hey, we're still on your side."
Yeah, that's it. I mean, this gets back to my point where I don't hate bureaucracies, because the Fed is a bureaucracy. And I'm not angry with the statutory mandates of inflation and employment. I'm not angry with the fixed terms that are longer for Fed chairs. I'm not angry for any of these.
You know, it's a committee of some pretty smart people, right? And it is a committee. There's no.
So you're angry about the EU, but you're not angry at the Fed, right? So this is what gets back to my point, is that for whatever reason, some institutions in the world economy have come under great scrutiny, and others that are frankly no different in their bureaucratic motivations are left to be flying the flag for all of us. And I just don't know whether we've finally gotten the model right, where we understand when and how and where democracy helps us and when it doesn't. And I think certainly with David Cameron, he got that answer dead wrong for England.
Yeah. Okay. And you know what? There's a scale issue here too. So I opened this podcast talking about my reading of the Constitution and understanding how important this American model was for a democratic republic. But that was a completely different scale 250 years ago, right? I think scale and technology change what a democratic republic can be.
Yeah, well, the basic thing you tried to straighten out at that time was a king, right? That someone was erratic and irresponsible, and you couldn't remove them. And this gets to an economic idea that at that point, if someone gets super erratic and irresponsible, that can take us all down. And the real worry at those times were wars. They weren't actually the economic situations, the depressions, but it was just wars. Guys getting in fights and sending you off to get killed, and they didn't have to fight them, so they let you do it, and you died.
Yeah, and they had they had to define liberty. You know, it sounded like we're going to value the individual's rights above all else, but they had to define liberty, you know, at some base level, and it's within the individual. But really, they were also talking about a nation being free.
Well, and the checks and balances were all about some single individual having no ability to rock the boat for the rest of us. Yeah. Right. And that's at the core of it all. And that the economic argument came later, which was those types of governments don't screw up economies either. But in truth, the Federal Reserve System came out of the 1917 period in the United States history. And why did it? It was because of the way banks didn't reserve enough in their deposits, and they weren't able to access a lender of last resort to forestall a crisis. And so the Fed was basically created around a different set of models, which gets to your point when the economy had such large numbers of transactions and so many were so liquid. The model of just saying, hey, let it deal with it itself didn't work. We saw big credit crunches, big credit cycles.
Yeah.
And since the Fed emerged, and then since John Keynes wrote his Money, Interest, and Employment and showed the Fed how to handle itself better and stimulate demand and stabilize economies better, there has been more stability in markets and more stability in economies. And that gets back to a different idea that most people like is, here is a bureaucratic institution that's certainly delivered for us.
Right. You know what? And I don't want to make it sound like I think that the Fed is the best idea or the best institution ever. It's just worked, and we learn lessons over time, right? So when Bernanke was reacting to the financial crisis of 07, 08, he was a depression scholar. So he was coming from knowing that history, right? And as you said, the Fed was created in 1913 to solve a certain problem, but it was necessary. We needed an institution to kind of hold things together and provide some kind of rules and regulations. Now the Fed has, what has the Fed done? It's kept rates low to prevent, first of all, they went super low and did QE to get us to rebuild confidence. But I don't think that anybody on the committee thinks they're so smart that they've got it all figured out. They know a black swan can show up and central banks can't fix everything. For now, they're doing a pretty good job. Hey, I want to read something from a recent Bank of America note. Their chief economics team. And they're talking about peak globalization. The world is not flat. Globalization, or unfettered cross-border flows of capital, goods, ideas, and people, is no longer a given. The powerful force that gave multinationals access to more resources, more workers, and more consumers is in retreat, owing to the global spike in nationalism and populism. Multinationals, as a result, have had to rethink how they do business. So unfettered globalism, meaning we thought, this would go on forever. Obviously, a corporation can be stopped in their tracks if there's some nationalist or populist movement. They go on here just talking about technology, and this is where I think that technology is the real driver of all this, and there will be ebbs and flows in policy. But one of the main beneficiaries around the reconfiguration of global supply chains will be automation, advanced robotics, AI, 3D printing, digital platforms, and related activities geared towards the ability to suppress costs, boost margins, and nimbly reach more demanding consumers. All of these forces will likely help multinationals shorten and simplify their global supply chains and build where they sell. My question for you is, this is what I've been talking about for so long, and I argue with everybody about it. Jobs go overseas regardless of policy in a world with free trade. When you have global free trade, some corporation is going to figure out a way to use cheaper labor elsewhere to make the things that American consumers want and provide jobs. It just goes in a cycle, right? Okay, you want the iPhone or the Nikes? I'm going to go make it over there.
And it's not a cycle, though. What it's called is chains of development. Chains.
I call it a cycle because the
reason it's a chain,
the jobs go over there,
but they don't come back. They go to the next chain down the link, which is Vietnam, and after Vietnam goes to Africa, and after Africa goes to some other place.
As long as the American consumers are buying those products and having some jobs related to those products.
But development then becomes a chain. It's one link after another, down through as the cost gets pushed out.
Okay, and
so the methodology of thinking about it is a chain. There's because the problem here is we're going to take China right now and deal with it with tariffs, and all we're going to do is push the development down the chain out of China to other parts of the world that are cheaper than China anyways. They're not going to bring the jobs back up the chain to the United States. They're going to push them down the chain. Because if you just target China, which is the biggest manufacturing market, they're going to either push their currency around like they're doing and make it not a very big deal. And after that doesn't work, then they're going to push down the chain. They're not going to push. You don't come up the chain. The only way you bring things back in is finding things that are more local and more relevant to local consumers, or technology, like you say, some type of manufacturing, speed to market, or some type of quality differential that can be delivered in a local way. These things bring it back up the chain. But generally speaking, all we're doing with tariffs is making a process of going down value chains more quickly happening.
All right, so simplify this for me. Is there any policy that can make a corporation bring jobs back here and it will have a net positive result?
Well, first of all, we got to talk about content requirements with autos. The answer is certainly that's already in place. And what a lot of the NAFTA did was take up a content requirement in the United States from 65 to 70%.
Okay.
So content requirements actually have already been in place for a long time, and they seem to work, right? You just say you got to build 70% of the car in the United States. And, so these types of things are not tariffs at all. They're just content requirements. And whenever, you get in these trade packs and look at them, it's a nightmare to even decide what's happening, because there'll be 500-600 pages of all these different things for all these different markets that people have discussed at length with all this detail. See, this is what I don't understand as an economist. When you see that level of detail, all you want to do is get it signed succinctly so that people know what the rules are, can go to page 20 that they care about for their vacuum cleaner or their spark plug or whatever, their dishwasher, and find out what the rules are. So to turn that into some type of ongoing debate is very unsettling to the producers of that thing.
So do you think there should be these content requirements across technology too for electronics?
See, even they might even be already in place. I don't even know, let's put the microchip on there. We know that's one of the most global of supply chains. But do I know, since there's so much patenting involved, whether a patenting has some element of, control of where the sourcing of certain things go, or knowledge of where they have to be made, or anything, or the patent person has a patent, has some control of that, government who issues the patent has some control of that. All these things can be in play because, you say, well, whose patent ideas are we going to work with? And they can be whatever they want to be in whatever country you're in. So, see, these are the reasons why people like me go, well, that's why you put the WTO in place, because you have to iron these things out and find one venue. And you're going to get back to the WTO one way or the other when 2 groups or 3 groups or 5 groups go in a different way. You're going to end up with some type of coordinating mechanism.
All right,
it gets back to my model. I'm in Telluride. Some one of the 5 of us had to figure out when we were going to leave. And so we decided we're going to leave before everybody's plane. And I ended up having to eat a cookie in Montrose for 3 hours to save me money. And that's the WTO. It's saying, okay, we have this complex problem of coordination, and we'll solve it this way.
All right, let's close this out with 2 companies in particular. FedEx, which I don't know how much you looked at their call.
Right, they got hammered.
Yeah, and they're blaming. Well, first of all, they were kind of did a big shrug, like we're not sure, but the global economy doesn't look that good to us. And they didn't say recession, but they talked about weak industry, weak manufacturing affecting their business. And yet we have the semiconductors roaring to new highs here. I'm writing a thing on applied materials today, making new highs, even though their earnings haven't made new highs. And the stock's up 70% for the year. To me, the FedEx thing, I just say, software is eating the world. Software is eating FedEx. It's like, we've eliminated so many things that need to be shipped, and costs have come down so much. It's not just the Amazon effect, but it's the cloud SaaS effect.
Well, see, we're getting back to this basic point that all this liquidity is driving up things in irregular ways that don't have anything to do with fundamentals, and so the answer is maybe they are overpriced.
some of the stocks, the
Yeah.
software and semis. Yeah.
So last year
Yeah.
they went down too much. Now they're going up too much.
Yeah.
And these are the things that this is what's the problem with this whole story we're in right now is it's no longer you're either going to ride it up higher because it's riding up and play the momentum, or you're going to point out the obvious that it's not tied to the fundamentals. And when does one camp win and when does one camp lose?
I think Druckenmiller just, there was an article about him this week where he said, yeah, I got it completely wrong. He didn't think it would keep going.
That's it. I mean, and the answer isn't there is one. I wrote this morning about this. It's going until it stops. And it's the same point of like, I stayed, as you know, long, overweight semiconductors all last year with and I got tons of email how angry people were a year ago for me.
Yeah.
And I just said, hey, mate, hold these for a year. Just cancel my service. Right?
Right.
And that was when Lamb was doing 120 and 285.
Yep.
So I'm sure I doubled everybody's money if they listen to anything.
If
and
you
I
hung
doubt
onto the semis,
half of those angry people will ever admit that I said that entire time. Right? So the point is right now everybody thinks the world has changed because their stocks are up on chips. And you and I know there is no rebound in chip production right now. There isn't. And that is going to be in place until it isn't. And then if it turns in a quarter or 3 months.
I think we've seen the trough, right? We've seen the trough in earnings, but the rate of acceleration here doesn't justify what the stocks are doing.
No. And this is just a fact until it isn't a fact. Yeah. And we get a backward looking, I told you so. But at the point is right now, a lot of things are running that have no basis in reality as far as economies go. And this is a situation that's unsettling at the very least.
All right. Well, I'm calling for S&P 3350 by Q3, and that's not that far away. But then, all bets are off. All cash to the sidelines, so to speak, as we go into the election. So we should revisit this, do this again in June, 6 months from now. We'll talk about Space Force if there is one, and how those resources are being allocated. And we'll see where the market's at going into the election. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, John.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.